So, finished another book recently, as I talk about in the description of this video. It was about NLP, not natural language processing, but something that I think is just as equally misunderstood by people who aren't that familiar with it. It's called neuro-linguistic programming. I know. If you don't know what that is, you may have heard it's something like voodoo or magic. But I don't know about you. I don't really believe in voodoo and magic like you see in like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. But I can definitely see how people could think that this is, something fake or, dangerous, like encryption or code. Those kind of things, So, what I've learned from this book is quite fascinating. It's not really that much different from what I've learned about psychology over the years, but I can also see why it's become so taboo since it first became popular in about the 1970s, in the rise and height and also a little bit of turmoil of clinical psychology in America after clinical psychology got thrown under the bus by the very marketers that made clinical psychology what it was, like Edward Bernays. He was a real big proponent for clinical psychology in America, really led the way in that industry. Counselors in the 1950s and 60s and so on, and then when marketers and industry were in capitalism were under blame in the 1970s, Edward Bernays kind of threw psychology under the bus, psychology and capitalism under the bus to protect his marketing and industry monopoly for all of his industrial clients. And that was also the time when NLP was starting to gain traction. And some people, kind of championed it forward, like Tony Robbins, who we know as a motivational, inspirational speaker in the United States, all over the world, actually. He's done a lot of good. And I know there's been a lot of bad press recently, as there seemed to be for pretty much every titan in the world right now, any sort of titan brand, whether it's personal or business brand. I think that's pretty much inevitable in the way things are done. Centralized is too much power is never good for any person. That being said, I find NLP, specifically neuro-linguistic programming, to be just as valid as psychology and coding. The same way that, you don't need to be a practicing psychologist to understand how to help somebody psychologically. Educators do this every day, parents, so many people can benefit from understanding a little bit of human psychology. And same thing with code. You don't need to have a computer science degree to be a programmer anymore. So when it comes to things like neuro-linguistic programming, it's pretty much a self-help book for psychology when it comes to communication. Something that we know psychologists and programmers kind of struggle with. And that's why I find neuro-linguistic programming very, very interesting, because these are the principles that successful salesmen and marketers have based, empires on. These paradoxical empires where they can say one thing but mean another thing and have another thing happen. These kind of irrational paradoxes that have created almost like a quantum logic when humans are involved. Especially when humans are perceiving something, and how to influence people when they aren't perceiving something, which is very reminiscent of the split test. What is it? split test thingy in quantum engineering, quantum mechanics, where when you observe the test, it reacts differently. And when you're not observing it, it becomes a wave, behaves like a wave when you are observing it, or even when you use a camera, it becomes it becomes matter. And that's quite interesting, because neurolinguistic programming is about as baffling as, quantum mechanics were to Einstein. And I see we're running into a problem in society, and it reminds me a lot of Einstein's reaction to quantum mechanics and quantum engineering towards the end of his life, when he was debating with his protege why why quantum mechanics was bunk, and he essentially proved it, but then his protege proved that his proof was based on an assumption that also disproved his entire proof that it was wrong. So essentially, his protege, who didn't have the same, anchors in the material world as Einstein, who started out as a patent clerk and was very, very interested in patents for communication. And when it came to things like what he called spooky action at a distance, there was no way to patent it, because a patent relies on, cause and effect. You have to be able to document cause and effect with an invention. And spooky action at a distance, which we now call quantum entanglement, which we use in major scientific experiments for communications and all sorts of things, there's no way to really patent it, because it's not cause and effect. It's just kind of spooky. But anyways, this isn't about quantum engineering or quantum entanglement. It's kind of about, our own personal bias, which I learned a lot about in this book that I talk about in the description, NLP. It's helped me in my marriage. It's helped me with sales. It's helped me as a marketer. It's helped me in so many ways in understanding that, some of it I learned through trial and error over the past year. I know I wouldn't have believed the parts about, bypassing diet and exercise by starting with your mindset. That part, I probably would have completely discounted that part even just 2 years ago. But that's one of the parts where I learned through trial and error. Like I've lost 150 pounds without dieting and exercising, listening to my body, changing my mindset. And what's interesting is over time, it looks more and more like diet and exercise, but did not start that way. In fact, I lost the bulk of the weight without dieting and exercising. And that's something a lot of people don't know is, that first 80 pounds, I did it without any dieting at all. In the first 120 pounds, I did it without any exercising at all. So, what I find is with the neurolinguistic programming stuff in there it's the principles of how the brain works. It's a lot of things that look a lot like the mysteries of algorithms and programming. It's something that I think data science will help us understand, how to turn some of the theories into proper hypothesis and actually get some more science out of it. But when it comes down to it, it's a good way to raise awareness. Looking at the theories as stories, because that's how we understand things like logical fallacies, so we can make less mistakes. And that being said, we get a lot out of this. And I think that we tend to push away the irrational and ignore the irrational and try and pretend like it doesn't exist, but it does exist. And in a way, it's more natural, and it exists even more than logic and rational thinking. Because keep in mind that logic and rational thought only show us the borders of nature, the borders of our reality, the borders of, essentially these matrices of logic and reason that we have become aware of. our irrational nature, the irrational nature of the universe and the world, is why we invented things like logic and rational thinking. That does not mean the natural world is logical or rational. And this is explored a lot in non-Euclidean geometry and how we transferred from, linear mathematics to quantum. For anybody who has any interest in that, I think if you think there's a future to things like quantum engineering, quantum science, all the quantum leap stuff, if you think there's a future to that, then you should definitely pick up the neurolinguistic programming book I have in the description. Get set up on the Plex server. You can stream. You won't be able to download, but you will be able to stream any of the content in my server. That's what makes it legal. It's sharing, so it's not publicly shared, so you have to create an account with Plex, and then you share that email with me, and I can get you hooked up to my server. It's a little bit like, sharing a Netflix password and login, but without actually sharing the Netflix password and login. So it's kind of like that simplicity, but also a little bit of, going over to your friend's house and borrowing a DVD. That's the magic of streaming that, is changing the music industry altogether, making it easier to listen to music. And now we can do that with other types of media, with streaming, with great services like Plex. So if you need any help getting set up with that, feel free to shoot me a message. This is a great book. I think it's going to be interesting to see what you understand intuitively in a book like this, what you're already practicing, what you believe in, what you don't believe in, and ask yourself a simple question of, what's the risk of just trying it? And so check it out. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Share this with anybody you think this may help. And happy reading.